In the valley town of Dry Creek, horses had once been the most valuable thing a farmer could own. For generations, every family in the valley relied on them. They pulled plows across the soil, carried supplies between farms, and helped transport crops to nearby markets miles away. A strong horse wasn't just an animal. It was power. It was income. And in many cases, it was survival. On warm summer mornings, the sound of hooves could be heard echoing across the valley as farmers rode out to their fields before sunrise. The entire rhythm of the town moved with the horses. But as the years passed, something slowly began to change. At first, it was small, just a few machines arriving from the nearby cities. Strange metal tractors that ran on noisy engines instead of muscle and breath. Many farmers laughed when they first saw them. These machines will never replace horses, some said. They break too easily. They cost too much. For a while, the farmers were right. The tractors were expensive, unreliable, and difficult to repair. Most families in Dry Creek kept doing what they had always done. They kept raising horses. But over time, the machines improved. Engines became stronger. Fuel became cheaper. And tractors started appearing on more farms across the region. Within a few years, something unexpected happened. The demand for horses began to fall. Farmers who once owned 5 or 6 horses now needed only 1 or 2. Some didn't need them at all. The livestock market slowly filled with horses that farmers no longer wanted. Prices began dropping, then dropping again. Soon the conversations around town started changing. At the small supply store near the center of Dry Creek, farmers gathered every morning to drink coffee and talk about the same problem. Horses aren't worth what they used to be. Feed costs more than the animals are worth. Tractors are faster anyway. One by one, families started selling their horses. Some sold half their herd. Others sold every animal they owned. The livestock auctions became crowded with horses. Healthy horses. Strong horses. Animals that would have been considered treasures only a few years earlier. Now they were being sold cheaply just to avoid the cost of feeding them. For most farmers, the decision felt simple. Why keep an animal that no longer made money? Why spend feed and water on something the market didn't want? But in Dry Creek, there was one farmer who looked at the situation differently. His name was Thomas Hale. Thomas wasn't the richest farmer in the valley. His land was modest. His house was small. But Thomas had a reputation for something unusual. He watched things closely. While other farmers rushed to make decisions, Thomas preferred to observe, to think, to ask questions others never considered. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the hills, Thomas stood beside the wooden fence of his pasture watching his 2 remaining horses graze quietly. The valley looked peaceful, but Thomas could feel the tension spreading through the town. Across the road, his neighbor was loading horses into a trailer. Another farmer down the hill had already sold his entire herd the week before. The sound of trucks leaving the valley with horses had become common. And yet, something about the situation didn't feel right to Thomas. Because while the farmers of Dry Creek believed horses had lost their value, Thomas believed something else was happening. He believed people were making decisions out of fear. And when fear spreads through a market, prices don't reflect real value. They reflect panic. The next morning, Thomas drove his old pickup truck to the livestock auction 2 towns away. The place was crowded. Dozens of trailers lined the dusty yard. Farmers stood beside their horses waiting for the auction to begin. Some looked tired. Others looked frustrated. Most simply wanted to sell their animals and move on. When the auctioneer started calling bids, the prices shocked Thomas. Strong horses were selling for less than the cost of feeding them for a month. Healthy animals were being sold simply because nobody wanted them anymore. Farmers shook their heads and accepted whatever price they could get. Because everyone believed the same thing. Horses were finished. They belonged to the past. But Thomas stood quietly beside the fence watching the auction ring. And slowly, a different idea began forming in his mind. What if everyone was wrong? What if the problem wasn't the horses, but the timing? Because while tractors were replacing horses on farms, there were still many places where machines couldn't go. Mountains, forests, ranches, remote lands where engines struggled and hooves still ruled the ground. And Thomas realized something important. When everyone sells something at the same time, supply explodes, prices collapse, but eventually supply disappears. And when that happens, value returns. That afternoon, while farmers were selling their horses as quickly as possible, Thomas Hale did something that made no sense to anyone watching. He raised his hand, and he bought one, then another, and then another. By the end of the auction, Thomas had purchased more horses than anyone else in the entire yard. Farmers looked at him with confusion. Some laughed. Others shook their heads. One man even walked over and said, "You must know something the rest of us don't." Thomas simply smiled, because the truth was, he didn't know exactly what would happen next. But he knew one thing for certain. When everyone rushes in one direction, sometimes the greatest opportunity lies in walking the other way. And in the quiet valley of Dry Creek, one man had just made the most unusual decision anyone had ever seen. He had started buying every horse he could find. Within a few weeks, news about Thomas Hale began spreading across the entire valley. At first, people only heard small rumors. Thomas bought 3 horses at the auction. Thomas bought another trailer full yesterday. But then the rumors grew bigger. He bought 12 this week. Someone said he bought 20. Soon, everyone in Dry Creek knew the story. While the rest of the valley was selling horses as quickly as possible, Thomas Hale was buying them. And not just 1 or 2. He was buying all of them. Every week, his old pickup truck and horse trailer could be seen driving toward the livestock auctions in nearby towns. Every week, he returned with more horses. Young horses, old horses, strong horses, even horses that farmers thought nobody would want. At first, people thought it was a temporary decision. Maybe Thomas had a plan for a few animals. Maybe he was starting some kind of small breeding program. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that something much stranger was happening. Thomas wasn't slowing down. He was speeding up. Soon his pasture began filling with horses. 10 became 20. 20 became 40. Within 2 months, Thomas Hale owned more horses than any other farmer in Dry Creek. And the valley had started talking about it. At the small general store where farmers gathered every morning for coffee, Thomas had become the main topic of conversation. One farmer leaned against the counter and shook his head. "That man has lost his mind." Another laughed. "He's buying animals that nobody wants anymore." A third farmer added, "Feed costs alone will ruin him." Because that was the real problem. Horses were expensive to keep. They needed food. They needed water. They needed space. And when animals stop producing income, every day they remain on the farm becomes another expense. Most farmers in Dry Creek had done the math already. Selling the horses had been the safest option, even if the price was low. But Thomas didn't seem to care. His farm slowly began transforming into something the valley had never seen before. The quiet pasture that once held 2 horses was now full of movement. Horses grazed across the fields. Others rested near the wooden barn. Some ran freely across the grass, kicking dust into the air as the wind moved through the valley. The sight was strange. Across the rest of Dry Creek, horse pastures were empty. But Thomas's land looked like a ranch from another time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, a group of farmers drove past his property. They slowed their trucks and stared across the fence. Dozens of horses moved across the field. One man laughed loudly. "Look at that. He's building a museum." Another farmer shook his head. "That pasture is going to eat every dollar he owns." The men drove away still laughing. And in many ways, their concerns were understandable. Because from the outside, Thomas's decision looked reckless. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't making money from the horses. He was only spending more feed, more water, more repairs for fences and barns. Some farmers even began making bets about how long it would last. 6 months, one said. He'll sell them all by winter. Others believed it would happen even sooner. But Thomas didn't respond to the jokes. He didn't argue. He didn't explain his plan. Instead, every morning before sunrise, he walked across the pasture checking the animals. He repaired fences. He stacked hay inside the barn. He made sure every horse had water. Day after day, he worked quietly while the valley continued selling horses. And the auctions kept filling with animals. Because the truth was, tractors were spreading faster than anyone had expected. Farms across the region were switching to machines. And every machine meant one less horse. Supply kept rising. Prices kept falling. By the end of summer, horses were selling for less than they had in decades. Farmers who once depended on them were now trying to get rid of them. And every time a new auction took place, Thomas Hale was there, standing beside the fence, watching the horses walk through the ring, waiting for the auctioneer to call the bids. Then slowly, he would raise his hand, again, and again, and again, until the horses belonged to him. People began calling him the the horse collector. Some called him stubborn, others called him foolish. But one thing everyone agreed on. Thomas Hale was taking a risk bigger than anyone in the valley had ever seen. Because if the market never changed, if horses truly had lost their value forever, then Thomas wasn't just buying animals. He was buying a future that might never exist. But Thomas believed something most people had forgotten. Markets move in cycles. And when something disappears too quickly, eventually someone will need it again. The only question was when. And that answer would come sooner than anyone in Dry Creek expected. By the time autumn returned to Dry Creek, the valley looked quieter than it had in decades. Where horses once moved across the hills every morning, most pastures now stood empty. Wooden fences stretched across the land with nothing behind them. The barns were still there. The stables were still there. But the animals that once filled them were gone. For most farmers, the transition to tractors had been complete. Fields were now plowed by machines. Crops were transported by trucks. And the old rhythm of hooves and saddles had slowly faded from daily life. To many people in Dry Creek, it felt like progress. But progress often hides something unexpected. Because while horses were disappearing from farms, they were becoming harder to find everywhere else. Across the region, the same thing had happened. Farmers had sold their horses quickly during the shift to machinery. Livestock auctions had been flooded with animals for months. And because supply was so high, prices had collapsed. But eventually, something changed. There simply weren't many horses left. And when supply disappears, markets begin to shift. The first signs came from ranchers in the mountains north of Dry Creek. Unlike farms in the valley, many of those areas were too rough for tractors. Steep trails, rocky hills, dense forests. Machines struggled in places where horses moved easily. For generations, ranchers had depended on horses to move cattle across difficult terrain. But now they faced a problem. Finding horses had suddenly become difficult. Many of the animals they once purchased from farming communities were gone. And when they did find horses for sale, the prices were rising. Then came the second sign. A group of forestry workers began searching for horses to help transport timber through areas where trucks couldn't reach. They needed strong animals that could navigate narrow forest paths. But again, supply was limited. Soon word began spreading through ranching towns and forestry camps. Good horses were becoming rare. And when something rare still has a purpose, its value begins to rise. Slowly at first, then faster. Within a few months, horse prices began climbing. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Buyers started traveling farther distances to find animals. Livestock auctions that once struggled to sell horses suddenly had buyers waiting. And then one day, a truck arrived in Dry Creek. It carried two ranchers from the northern mountains. They had heard something interesting. They had heard that a farmer in Dry Creek owned more horses than anyone else in the valley. The ranchers drove slowly along the dirt road that led to Thomas Hale's farm. When they reached the wooden fence surrounding his pasture, they stopped their truck. And for a moment, they simply stared. Because the rumors were true. Horses covered the pasture. Dozens of them. Strong animals grazing calmly across the field. More horses than they had seen in one place for years. Thomas stood near the barn repairing a section of fence when the ranchers approached. One of them asked a simple question. "Are these horses for sale?" Thomas looked across the pasture. Then he nodded. "Some of them," he said. That afternoon, the ranchers purchased 6 horses. And they paid a price that made Thomas smile quietly. Because those same animals had cost him almost nothing at the auction months earlier. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more buyers arrived. Ranchers, forestry crews, even riding schools from nearby towns that were struggling to find horses for training. The trucks kept coming. And every time they arrived, they found exactly what they were looking for. Healthy horses, strong horses, animals that had been cared for and trained while the rest of the valley had been selling theirs. For the first time in months, the dirt road leading to Thomas Hale's farm became busy. Trailers arrived empty and left full. Across the valley, farmers began noticing something strange. They had sold their horses months earlier for almost nothing. But now buyers were paying several times that amount. One afternoon, a group of farmers gathered again at the small general store. The conversation was quieter than usual. Someone finally said what everyone else was thinking. "We sold too early." Another farmer nodded slowly. "We thought horses were finished." The men stood in silence for a moment. Because they all knew the truth. The valley had made its decision together. They had followed the same logic. The same fear. The same belief that the future had no place for horses. Everyone, except Thomas Hale. He hadn't predicted exactly what would happen. He hadn't known when demand would return. But he had understood something that markets have always done. They overreact. When something loses popularity, people abandon it quickly. Prices collapse. Supply disappears. And eventually, when someone needs it again, there isn't enough left. By the end of the year, Thomas had sold many of his horses. But not all of them. He kept several grazing peacefully across the pasture. Sometimes visitors still stopped along the road to watch them. And occasionally someone would ask the same question. How did you know? Thomas would usually give the same answer. I didn't know. I just paid attention. Because in the quiet valley of Dry Creek, the greatest lesson had nothing to do with horses at all. It was about something far more important. When everyone rushes in one direction, the greatest opportunity often lies in the opposite one. And sometimes, the difference between losing everything and gaining everything is simply the courage to think for yourself.